My world was books. Always had been. The quiet solace of a library, the comforting scent of aging paper and leather, the hushed reverence of the stacks. This was my sanctuary. My name is Miles Patton, and at 36, I was precisely where I wanted to be, surrounded by stories, a guardian of knowledge. I was an introvert by nature, more comfortable navigating the labyrinthine Dewey Decimal System than social gatherings. People, with their unpredictable emotions and chaotic demands, were far less appealing than the predictable wisdom contained within a hardbound cover. The Sterling Municipal Library was a grand, old dame of a building, a Victorian-era architectural marvel with towering Gothic arches, stained glass windows that cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished oak floors, and a palpable sense of history clinging to every dusty corner. It had stood for over a century, a silent sentinel in the heart of the city, and within its walls, I felt a peace I found nowhere else. My latest assignment, however, was testing that peace. I've been tasked with cataloging and organizing the rarely used, almost forgotten, West Wing Annex. Locals called it the Dead Zone, a section filled with ancient, obscure, and often uncatalogued tomes, some dating back centuries. It was a librarian's dream, a treasure trove of forgotten lore, but also a monumental undertaking. The annex was rarely visited by patrons. Its heavy oak door usually kept locked, its existence almost a secret. It was a vast, echoing space, perpetually dim, even when the main library was bathed in sunlight. This was my new, solitary project, a deep dive into the library's forgotten heart, and my first few days in the annex were a blissful immersion. I worked methodically, shelf by shelf, my gloved hands carefully handling brittle pages. The only sounds were the soft rustle of my movements, the occasional distant clang from the main library, and the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling into its bones. I attributed them to the ancient timbers, the shifting foundations, the whispers of time itself. Then, the subtle disturbances began. IT started with a faint, almost imperceptible rustling sound. It wasn't the sound of my own movements, nor the gentle turning of a page. It was distinct, originating from a distant shelf, like a flurry of tiny wings. I'd pause, listen intently, but it would cease. Mice, I'd tell myself, or just the dust settling. The annex was old, after all. It was bound to have its quirks about a week into the project. As I was reaching for a particularly thick volume on European folklore, a book from a high shelf directly above me suddenly tumbled down. It landed on the worn Persian rug with a soft thud, startling me. I bent down, my heart thumping a little faster than usual. It was a massive, leather-bound tome, its spine cracked, titled The Compendium of Lost Souls. It had fallen open. My eyes scanned the page it had landed on. It wasn't random text. It was a macabre illustration, a detailed engraving of a skeletal figure beckoning from a swirling vortex, surrounded by tiny, tormented faces. Below it, a short, unsettling poem about souls trapped between worlds. I shivered, a cold prickle on my skin. Coincidence, I muttered, forcing the word. Just a coincidence. I picked up the book, carefully placed it back on its shelf, and tried to dismiss the image from my mind. But the image and the poem lingered. The rustling became more distinct, no longer just a faint sound, but a rapid, frantic turning of pages, as if an invisible hand was rifling through the entire collection. It would start on one shelf, then jump to another, a wave of agitated paper. I'd walk towards the sound, but it would always stop just as I approached, leaving me in the oppressive quiet. Then came the whispers. Faint, almost subliminal, they drifted on the stagnant air currents of the annex. They were just at the edge of hearing, like a radio tuned to a frequency just beyond reception. I'd strain my ears, trying to decipher them, but they would coalesce, forming fragments of sound, never quite clear enough to understand. My imagination, I told myself, a trick of the acoustics in this vast, ancient space. The solitude was getting to me, point one afternoon, as the late autumn light filtered weakly through the high, grimy windows. Another book fell. This time, it wasn't a heavy tome from a high shelf, but a slender, unassuming volume on local history, falling softly from a lower shelf, almost at my feet. It was an ancient, leather-bound volume, its title barely legible, Echoes of Sterling, a Forgotten History. When I picked it up, it was open to a blank end paper, yellowed with age. Tucked inside, almost hidden by the binding, is a small, folded piece of brittle, yellowed paper, and my fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The paper was so delicate it threatened to crumble. In faded, sepia-toned ink, written in an elegant, looping script that spoke of a bygone era, was a single word, repeated over and over. Miles. Miles. Miles, my breath hitched. My name, written by a hand long dead, tucked inside a book that had been dormant for decades. The air in the annex suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. The whispers, though still indistinct, seemed to intensify, swirling around me, a chorus of unseen voices that I stared at the note, my mind racing through every possible explanation. A previous librarian's note? A bizarre, elaborate prank by a mischievous colleague? A forgotten bookmark from a patron with the same name? I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical anchor in the sea of the inexplicable. I even checked my personnel file, then the library's archive staff records. No one else named Miles Patton had worked here, certainly not in the last 50 years. That I tucked the note into my pocket, a strange, cold weight against my thigh. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but the unease had taken root, a cold seed blossoming into full-blown dread. The whispers, though still just beyond comprehension, seemed to follow me now, a constant, low murmur at the periphery of my hearing. The cold spots in the forgotten wing became more pronounced, distinct pockets of chilling air that made me shiver despite my heavy cardigan. I started to feel watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were following my every move between the towering shelves. The quiet solace of a library was slowly, terrifyingly eroding. The notes became more frequent, more disturbing, and undeniably personal. I found them tucked into different ancient tomes, always in the forgotten wing, always saying my name. It was no longer just a single note. It was a deluge. The handwriting varied wildly, each script a chilling testament to a different era, a different hand. A child's shaky scrawl, barely legible, tucked into a primer on Victorian etiquette. A shaky, elderly hand, the ink bleeding slightly, pressed into a medical textbook from the early 1900s. A frantic, jagged script, as if written in a desperate hurry, crammed into a volume of forgotten poetry. Each note was on different paper, brittle parchment, thin onion skin, thick, pulpy rag paper from different eras, some so old they crumbled at the edges. The repetition of my name intensified, a desperate plea echoing through time. Miles, hear us. Miles, help. Miles, don't look away. Then, the warnings began to appear. Tucked into a book on local architecture, a note in a precise, almost clinical hand read, Miles, beware the silence. Another, scrawled on a fragment of what looked like a ledger, whispered, Miles, he watches. And the most chilling, found pressed into a Bible from the Civil War era, Miles, they lied. These warnings were often accompanied by cryptic symbols, a crude, looping knot, a distorted eye, a broken chain, or disturbing sketches. A faceless figure in a long coat, a distorted face screaming silently, a child stick figure hanging from a gallows. Each discovery sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. One particular note, found in a dilapidated copy of Grimm's fairy tales, was written in a delicate, almost childlike script. It simply said, "Miles, she's still here." I dismissed it as a morbid coincidence until, a few days later, a book on the history of local orphanages fell open to a page describing a fire that had claimed the lives of several children in the late 1800s. The name of one of the victims, a young girl, was Eleanor. The connection, however tenuous, sent a shiver down my spine. The whispers were no longer subliminal. They were distinct, multi-layered voices, a cacophony of murmurs. They called my name, pleaded, sometimes screamed, a chorus of agony and desperation. They seemed to emanate directly from the shelves, from the very pages of the books, as if the paper itself was vibrating with their anguish. I could almost make out individual voices now, a child's high-pitched wail, an old woman's frail plea, a man's guttural groan that I felt a constant, oppressive presence in the forgotten wing, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. I started seeing fleeting shadows in my peripheral vision, quick blurs that vanished when I turned my head. Sometimes I'd catch the brief, distorted reflection of a face in the glass of a display case, a fleeting, skeletal visage that would vanish the moment I focused. The cold spots were no longer isolated. The entire annex felt like a walk-in freezer, a chill that penetrated my bones as I tried to share my experiences. Mr. Abernathy, the kind but perpetually skeptical senior librarian, was my confidant. He was a man of logic, a staunch believer in the tangible. "Miles," he said, peering over his spectacles, a faint smile playing on his lips, "you've been spending too much time in that dusty old annex. It's the quiet, you know, plays tricks on the mind. You're probably just overworked." He suggested I take a few days off, get some fresh air. His gentle dismissal, though well-intentioned, only isolated me further. How could I explain that the books were calling my name? That the dead were whispering secrets through brittle paper? He would think I was mad. And perhaps I was driven by fear and a desperate need for answers. I began my own research into the library's history, specifically the Forgotten Wing. I abandoned my cataloging duties, my new obsession overriding everything else. I delved into archived blueprints, old city records, and obscure local histories. What I uncovered sent a cold dread through me. The West Wing Annex, I discovered, was not an original part of the Sterling Municipal Library. It had been built much later, in the late 1800s, over the foundations of an older structure. That structure? A former almshouse, a grim institution for the poor, the sick, and the mentally infirm. Before that, local legends hinted at it being a burial ground for victims of a forgotten plague in the 17th century. The ground itself was steeped in misery that I found records of previous librarians who had worked in that wing. The pattern was chilling. Many left abruptly, citing nervous conditions or unspecified illnesses. One, a Miss Eliza Thorne in 1912, was institutionalized after claiming the book spoke to her. Another, Mr. Thomas Croft in 1947, simply disappeared without a trace, his last entry in the daily log mentioning unusual activity in the West Wing. An old newspaper clipping from 1920, yellowed and brittle, mentioned a peculiar madness afflicting staff in that section, attributing it to bad air or overwork. No one had ever connected the dots. I also learned about a specific, tragic event, the Great Sterling Fire of 1888. It had swept through a large section of the city, claiming hundreds of lives. The almshouse, then a makeshift hospital, had been overwhelmed. Many of the sick and injured, unable to escape, had perished within its walls. The library, built years later, stood as a monument over countless forgotten graves. The books, I realized, were not merely housed in a haunted place. They were absorbing the very essence of the tragedy, connecting the disparate handwritings on the notes, the varying ages of the paper, the historical tragedies associated with the site, and the relentless, multi-layered whispers, I formed a terrifying theory. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something far more insidious, far more profound. The books weren't just filled with stories. They were prisons for restless minds, for the echoes of people who had died within or near the library, or whose lives were profoundly tied to the knowledge within these very volumes. Their final thoughts, their desperate pleas, their unfinished stories, their very essence. They were imprinted onto the pages, trapped within the paper, bound by the ink. Each book a miniature tomb, a silent scream frozen in time. The calling, the whispers, the notes, they were their desperate attempt to communicate, to be heard, to be released. They had found a conduit in me, a librarian who listened, who understood the silent language of books, who was perhaps just sensitive enough to hear the echoes of the dead. The realization was horrifying, but it also brought a strange, morbid clarity. I wasn't going mad. I was merely listening to the dead. The communication from the books became urgent, almost frantic. The whispers were no longer a distant murmur. They were a cacophony, a desperate chorus of overlapping voices, each calling my name, each pleading, each demanding. Miles, help us. Miles, find it. Miles, release us. The sheer volume was overwhelming, a constant assault on my sanity. The notes, too, transformed. They were no longer just warnings. They were specific demands, scrawled with an almost violent urgency. One note, found in a tattered copy of the history of Sterling's founders, directed me to the scholar's vault beneath the silence. Another, written on a scrap of what looked like a child's drawing, pointed to the Book of the Chained Ones, where the light dies. They were directing me, guiding me, pushing me towards something. The entities began to manifest more directly. Books would not just fall, but slide off shelves, landing with a deliberate thud. I felt cold breaths on my neck, even when no window was open. Faint sense of decay, then suddenly, cloying perfume would waft through the air. Once, as I reached for a book, I saw a clear, momentary indentation of a handprint on a dusty cover, as if someone had just gripped it, then vanished. I was terrified, but also compelled. I was their last hope. I had to understand what they wanted. Was it to be read? To be acknowledged? To have their stories told? To find peace? I started talking to them, whispering into the silence of the annex. What do you want? What can I do? The whispers would intensify in response, a frantic, unintelligible babble. The notes became my only guide. The scholar's vault. I remembered an old, sealed-off section mentioned in the library's original blueprints, a sub-basement rarely accessed, supposedly used for storing sensitive historical documents. Where the light dies. It had no windows, only a single bare bulb. I spent days searching for a way into the scholar's vault. The notes kept coming, guiding me, sometimes with cryptic riddles, sometimes with direct instructions. Behind the false wall, one note read, tucked into a book on masonry. I found it, a section of shelving in the deepest part of the annex that sounded hollow when tapped. Behind it, a hidden door almost seamlessly blended into the wall. It was secured by an old, rusted padlock. Another note, found in a book on locksmithing, contained a crude drawing of a key and a series of numbers. It was a combination. With trembling hands, I input the numbers. The lock clicked. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a narrow, dusty staircase descending into absolute darkness. The cold emanating from it was bone-chilling, far more intense than anything I had felt before. I descended into the scholar's vault, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, old paper, and something else, something metallic like old blood. The whispers were deafening now, a swirling vortex of voices, each one distinct, yet all blending into a terrifying chorus of agony and despair. The cold was unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on me. The vault was a small, circular room, lined with shelves of ancient, unmarked ledgers and journals. In the center, on a pedestal, sat a single, massive, leather-bound book. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, and the whispers seemed to emanate directly from it, a vortex of tormented sound. This was the Book of the Chained Ones. As I approached, spectral images began to flash before my eyes, a terrifying montage of the past. I saw faces distorted by pain and fear, a young woman coughing blood, an old man weeping, a child's terrified scream. I saw flashes of the Great Sterling Fire, not as a distant historical event, but as a living, burning hell. I saw the almshouse, its rooms overflowing with the sick, the dying, the forgotten. I saw a figure cloaked in shadow, moving through the chaos, not helping but observing. And then, a chilling realization. The figure was a librarian, a former guardian of this very wing, his face contorted with a dark satisfaction as he sealed the doors, trapping the dying inside. He wasn't trying to save them. He was collecting them, trapping their final moments, their consciousness, within the very books they had sought solace in. He was the he watches from the notes. He was the one who lied. I reached for the book. My hand trembled, but a strange compulsion drove me forward. The voices screamed, a crescendo of pure terror. I opened the book that it wasn't a book of stories or history. It was a ledger of souls. Each page was filled with names, dates, and chillingly brief descriptions. John Doe, consumed by fever, 1888. Eleanor Vance, lost to the flames, 1888. Unnamed child, perished in smoke, 1888. It was a meticulous record of every soul who had died within the almshouse, whose final moments had been deliberately imprinted into the very pages of this monstrous book by the twisted librarian. He hadn't just collected books, he had collected souls, binding them to the library, to their final, agonizing moments. The peculiar madness wasn't a disease. It was the psychic residue of hundreds of trapped minds. I held the book, the voices within me, around me, reached a terrifying peak. I saw the librarian's face, a gaunt, cruel smile, as he wrote the final entry. He was the true horror, the architect of this spectral prison. I slammed the ledger shut, the echoes of the screams still ringing in my ears. The light from the book faded, and the overwhelming cacophony of voices diminished, replaced by a softer, more mournful murmur. The cold lessened, though it never entirely disappeared. I had unveiled the truth, the profound injustice that bound these souls to the library. The former librarian, a dark scholar, had not just collected books. He had collected lives, trapping them in a macabre archive of suffering that I didn't try to release them with a ritual. I knew, instinctively, that their peace lay in their stories being known, their suffering acknowledged, their captor exposed. I carefully took the ledger, along with a selection of the most poignant notes, and brought them back to my main office. Away from the West Wing annex, the intensity of the haunting diminished significantly. The frantic rustling ceased. The notes stopped appearing. The screams faded, replaced by faint, almost wistful whispers that sounded less like torment and more like distant echoes of gratitude. I still felt their presence, a profound, unsettling connection to the library and its spectral inhabitants. I was now the guardian of their stories, the unwilling keeper of a terrible secret. I never spoke of what I found in Mr. Abernathy or anyone else. How could I? They would never believe me. But I dedicated myself to the forgotten histories, to researching the lives of those listed in the ledger. I started writing not fiction, but detailed, anonymous historical accounts, sharing their stories with the world one by one, giving voice to the voiceless. The West Wing Annex remains. I still work there sometimes, though the silence is no longer absolute. There's a faint, perpetual hum, a low murmur that only I can hear. The cold spots are still there, a constant reminder. And sometimes late at night, when the library is empty and the city sleeps, I hear a faint, almost loving whisper carried on the air, like the turning of a page. Miles, I'm a librarian, and the books still call my name. But now I know why, and I listen, forever changed, forever bound to the restless minds within the pages, a silent monument to the enduring power of forgotten stories.